for us. We have a lot of national security and diplomatic experience at our next panel. We're joined by Doug Ollivant, as a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's a former director for Iraq on the National Security Council. I'm also joined by John Herbst, who's the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. He's currently a senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. All right, Ambassador Herbst, do you want to start us off on the regime change conversation? One I didn't think we'd necessarily be having this afternoon, but it's the president who's introduced the term, endorsed by Lindsey Graham. As I said, no surprise, but it's in stark contrast to what we heard from some administration officials earlier in the day. What do you make of it?
It's really quite striking, because Trump and his senior national security team had been saying up to that point, this is only about making sure Iran never has a nuclear weapon. Whether Trump meant that as a serious thing, as opposed to something to tell Iran, do not strike the United States because it could really be disaster for you, is a question mark. But certainly this will excite, in a negative way, the naives in the MAGA movement who don't understand the reason for American power to be exercised against an adversary like Iran.
When I say, Doug, that it was in stark contrast to what we heard earlier in the day, I was watching an interview with Secretary Rubio. He was asked directly about this, said, no, that's not the point here. We're trying to go after the nuclear program. And now I have a clip I want to play from Secretary Hegseth at his briefing on the scope of this Operation Midnight Hammer and how he put it. Here's Pete Hegseth earlier today.
Anything can happen in conflict, we acknowledge that, but the scope of this was intentionally limited. That's the message that we're sending. With the capabilities of the American military nearly unlimited. So Iran, in that sense, has a choice.
Is that your sense, Doug? Is that changing now with these new comments from the president? I know it's tough to tell.
Well, it's very tough to tell. And, regime change can mean lots of things. Let's be clear, the Iranian regime is relatively fragile. You have the supreme leader at the top, and were he to disappear from the scene, whether by natural causes or otherwise, usually most observers think the IRGC is really the ones who would choose his successor or have significant influence over his successor. But they've been largely decimated by the Israelis in the past week. So that whole level of command and control in the Iranian regime has been removed. So it's no longer impossible to imagine some type of regime change. Now, what that would look like is totally unknown, whether power would just dissolve down to other institutions. The Iranian army, the Iranian intelligence service are still there, still extant, just subordinated to the IRGC. It's possible they could take power. You do have these, opposition groups, the MEK, the monarchists. It's possible, though I think very unlikely, that one of them could emerge, or it could be some kind of color revolution-ish, where you have a mass uprising of the Iranian people. I don't think that's what we're intending, but as the Israelis in particular are taking out these levels of the IRGC and impacting their political influence over the regime, I think all kinds of things become possible that weren't possible a month ago.
I wonder what both of you would think. And actually, I'll stay with you, Doug, for a moment. And then I know Ambassador Herbst, from his experience, which is different, will weigh in on this as well. But I mentioned your experience, Doug, in Iraq. So, and I understand no two countries are the same. But are there lessons there about this topic, regime change, that we've learned? And if so, what are they, or what were they for you?
Well, certainly the lesson learned from Iraq is regime change is a lot harder than most people think it is. And Iran is orders of magnitude harder. Iraq, when we invaded it, was a country of 23 million. As we, have all been seeing on the clips lately, Iran is much larger. It's over 2 times as large as Texas. This is a really big country with a much larger population and would be exponentially more harder to control than Iraq. I mean, that said, I don't think anyone in their wildest dreams is talking about putting troops inside Iran to try to contour the outcome in any way, shape, or form.
But to that point, Ambassador Herbst, about regime change being, harder than it seems, I heard some commentary recently that what happened, or what has happened in Syria, almost made it look too easy, and it would be much different this time. What's your perspective on the topic?
Look, we learned in a very hard fashion in Iraq and Afghanistan and in Libya that we cannot organize a regime change. And when people talk about regime change now in Iran, and that includes President Trump's remarks, they're basically saying that we could weaken the government to a certain extent that it no longer exercises control. But it doesn't mean that we, the United States, are somehow designating the successor. And the way regime change could work, but again, I'm not advocating this policy. I think it's beyond our capacity. Right. But the way it could work to our advantage, and for that matter, to the advantage of the Iranian people, is by weakening, and actually the Israelis have done more on this than we have, the Revolutionary Guards. Perhaps we could free the army to establish a counterforce to the Iranian, the IRGC, and they may be more pragmatic than the fanatics in the Revolutionary Guards and, of course, among the mullahs. And our role is simply, and the Israeli role is weakening the government, and then Iran chooses its successor.
Does that make sense to you, Doug, or would you rather see it more limited and you know what the officials talked about this morning?
Look, I mean, any type of regime change is going to create chaos. But I think the ambassador and I are essentially saying the same thing, that, the most likely outcome, should the mullahs and the IRGC be sufficiently weakened by, as he said, mostly these Israeli attacks. But again, should the Iranians retaliate against U.S. bases in the region, then I think we would join in that with the same intelligence the Israelis have. If you remove the IRGC from the equation, and then the mullahs, either by natural causes or by external forces, get pushed to the side, then there are these other institutions in Iranian society. And I think the ambassador and I agree that that's the most likely, though by no means certain, place for power to devolve to.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.